Good afternoon and welcome to the October 18th, 2023 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And with that, I thank you for joining us, and I call this work session of the Eugene City Council to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. We have three work sessions today that are somewhat linked and related to work we did last year with the Planning Division's work plan. And we'll come back to that, I think, before we start the neighborhood planning section. Hopefully we'll get to that. So for that today, we're going to start off with the industrial zone, public health zone item, and then we'll move into gas stations, and then we'll move into neighborhood planning. And I think this first item is being kicked off by Lydia. Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Lydia Bishop, Building and Permit Services Director, and I just lost my note. Sorry about that. I'm here with Reed Bishop, who is our Land Use Supervisor, and we'll be discussing public health industrial development standards. So the concept of a public health overlay zone was raised by community members. The groups Beyond Toxics and West Eugene Community Coalition submitted a draft ordinance as a response to the inequitable pollution burden on Bethel and West Eugene neighborhoods. There had been a recent industrial business closure that had pollution and livability impacts to the area, which partially precipitated the request for this overlay zone. So let's see. Following these requests, Council made a motion in February of 22 to direct staff to return with a work session on the public health overlay concept. In May of 2022, Jason Dedrick presented a related topic on addressing chronic toxic polluters, which clarified the responsibilities of various agencies related to public health standards. Detailed information from that May work session is included in your packet as attachment A. Then in September of 2022, PDD staff, including myself, came before Council responding to your work session request to provide information on the public health overlay zone concept. At that meeting, we looked at public health overlay zones, looked at approaches for other communities to address health standards, and also looked at different implementation tools that could address these health issues. The overlay zone submitted by Beyond Toxics and the West Eugene Community Coalition drew heavily from the Clear Lake overlay zone. It's important to note that the Clear Lake overlay zone was applied primarily to large undeveloped greenfield sites that had been previously located outside of Eugene's urban growth boundary. Bringing the land inside the UGB increased these properties' development potential. So while the Clear Lake overlay zone includes stricter standards than we find in other sections of the Eugene Code, because the property was currently undeveloped, there weren't any conflicts with applying these stricter standards. At the September meeting, staff reviewed the fact that an overlay zone is just one of the tools that can achieve the desired public health outcomes. An overlay zone is generally limited to a specific geographic area, and it's a complex process that changes the enzoning of the affected properties. The other tools that we discussed at that September meeting included looking at development standards such as buffers, setbacks, increased landscape standards, to name a few. The development standards approach is what we're proposing here today and is consistent with recommendations from some of the councilors last September. Many of the components recommended in the overlay zone can be codified as development standards. And this process is much more streamlined and can be directed to address the immediate community needs. These standards would also be applicable to all industrial areas and is a more equitable approach. So what we're asking for council today is to initiate a land use code amendment to allow us to explore this approach more fully, and Reed will discuss details about that at the end of this presentation. And then just related to the comment that I made before, there are other regulatory authorities that address pollutants and other health issues. And so what we'll be looking at with the council's direction with development standards is to fill gaps not covered by other Eugene Code or other agencies. With that, I'll turn it over to Reed to delve further into the discussion about the industrial development standards and details on our next steps. So on to you, Reed. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lydia. So in addition to those other pollutant regulations is Chapter 9 of the Eugene Code, the Land Use Code. The purpose of the Land Use Code is to protect and promote the health, safety, and general welfare of the public, and to preserve and enhance the economic, social, and environmental qualities of the community. The Land Use Code uses a number of different tools to mitigate potential impacts from uses permitted in certain zones on neighboring properties. Some of those tools include setbacks, which are areas measured from front or interior property lines in which buildings, structures, and some uses are prohibited. Setback standards vary depending on the property's zoning designation, as well as the designation of neighboring properties. Another tool is buffers, which are similar to setbacks in that they prohibit development within certain areas. However, buffers typically apply to protected natural resource areas, waterways, or other conservation areas. There are also multiple sections of the Land Use Code devoted to landscape standards. The required amount and location of landscaping is determined by the zone and the use characteristics of the site. For instance, interior property lines for parking areas adjacent to residentially zoned property require a 7-foot wide landscape strip along the perimeter of the parking area that is landscaped to the L3 high screen landscape standard, which has its own specific requirements for shrubs, trees, and living plant material coverage. In order to limit the impact on adjacent properties, the Land Use Code includes additional regulations like screening for garbage collection areas, maximum lot coverage, open space requirements, or limitations on outdoor storage uses. There are also the permitted use tables, which lay out what uses are permitted or conditionally permitted in each of the zones. Uses that are not identified in the zoning table are prohibited in that zone. The use tables also identify certain uses that are subject to additional special use limitations, such as the 1,000-foot buffer between retail marijuana dispensaries. Now we'll take a look at the relevant industrial zone development standards, which were provided as Attachment C to the AIS. The industrial zone development standards do include some provisions aimed at minimizing impacts on neighboring residential properties. For instance, while there are no required front yard setbacks in the I2, light medium industrial, and I3, heavy industrial zones, there is a required 20-foot interior yard setback for sites that abut property zoned residential or park and open space. Delivery and loading areas are not permitted in this setback to help mitigate the impact of industrial vehicles on neighboring residential properties. Additionally, when an industrial development site borders residentially zoned property, a 10-foot wide L4 high screen landscape is required within the interior yard setback. Also, outdoor storage areas are not permitted on lots abutting residential zones. So as you can see, the current version of the Land Use Code does have some tools to help protect residential properties, and these standards can be modified in order to increase the effectiveness in preventing the impacts of pollution. Which brings us to a summary of the next steps for the project. As Lydia mentioned, we are here today to request the Council initiate a Land Use Code amendment. Throughout the fall, we will continue to research the available tools that can be used to help protect residential neighborhoods from the impacts of industrial development. This winter, we will conduct public outreach that includes those neighborhoods that experience the disproportionate impacts of industrial development, as well as existing industrial business and property owners and members of the development community. In the spring of 2024, we will work with the Eugene Planning Commission to incorporate public feedback in order to propose changes to the industrial uses and development standards that will help mitigate the impacts on neighboring residential properties and other vulnerable uses. We then plan to return to the City Council in the summer of 2024 with a draft proposal. This concludes our presentation for the afternoon. We are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will just encourage, oh, looks like everybody's online. So I see already that Randy has his hand raised. So Randy, I'll just turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. My concern is, do we have an idea of what the buffer zone space will be? I know there's been some proposals that have come down the pike for, larger separation, but what are you thinking with this approach?
Councilor Groves, at this point, that like Reed said, we really are at the point of researching what tools are available. So, we'd want to look at where those residential areas are in relation to the industrial properties. Some might be separated by a street, and maybe the buffers would be in the form of a setback for the industrial use from the property line. Screening standards could be used, landscape standards could be used, or there could be an additional buffer from the property line. But we don't have any preconceived outcomes at this point. We're really looking for feedback from neighborhood, from research that we do about other places. And then we would come back to you with a recommended proposal.
Okay, that's something I would be very interested in seeing. I mean, in the case of the J.H. Baxter facility, we already have a street as a buffer zone, and yet we still have contamination that's permeated the properties, to the north of that location. And then, of course, we don't even know what's happened to the south because that wasn't tested, because it's also industrial areas. But I know this is of grave concern to the neighbors that surround Baxter, but more importantly, not more importantly, but equally importantly, is looking at the future and how we prevent similar scenarios from happening, whether it's industry setting down on top of residential areas or residential areas popping up in close proximity to industrial areas, that we have an adequate space to protect against what we're experiencing right now in Bethel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Randy. Not Randy, sorry, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. I missed a portion of the presentation. I am sorry, as I was getting from work to the meeting. I guess my first question along the lines of what Councilor Groves began with, what's the farthest distance away that we saw measurable effect from J.H. Baxter in residential areas?
Councilor Clark, I can't answer that specifically. And, one of the challenges that we have with Baxter is that there were rules and regulations and permits that they had in place that were not followed, right? So that's a challenge from an enforcement standpoint. But my understanding is it was significant. I don't know, Reed, if you've delved into that research yet. But again, I think that's something similar to Councilor Groves' comment that we would be looking into and bringing you back that information when we return, if you choose to initiate that code amendment. So, Reed, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I don't have the details on how far that they saw those pollution impacts, but yeah, I think we'll look into that for going forward.
Well, I appreciate that. That'll be information that's useful, and as we go forward and discuss this again. Unless I miss my guess, the people of Eugene and the people that have spoken about this, especially in Bethel, are interested in us protecting them from another situation just like this occurring. Okay. And that's a that's a very worthwhile policy goal from my standpoint. I say, yeah, to the degree we can, let's make rules that make sense so that we're not citing intentionally potential dangerous situations around residential areas. That makes perfect sense. But it's in contrast, and I suggest maybe conflict with another policy goal, which is to build densely. So I want to know at the end of the day, what percentage of buildable land supply is affected by the whatever outcome we come to with this, because depending on the buffer, we're going to need it to be effective so that it's intelligent as a protection mechanism, but then it's also something that we're going to have to, we need desperately to build more houses. And so we're going to have to take those two items into account and a code that makes sense with it. So I will be very interested to see the details on the ground, as it were, as this moves forward. Thanks.
Randy, I see you have your hand raised. So I just want to give others a minute. Alan, go ahead for a first round.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with what Randy and Mike said. This is about preventing another Baxter, and to the degree that we can do that, we should give it a try. It's not perfect, but it looks like a good idea. Of course, the devil's in the details, but I'm willing to move this along to the next phase, developing it more, figuring this out more, and seeing what it actually looks like. In the end, I think we'll end up with something that's probably is workable, and it'll actually hopefully accomplish the goals that we're trying to do, which is prevent another Baxter by having these buffers and other things that are included in this. So definitely in favor of moving this along.
And Randy, I know you have a second comment. I just wanted to interject just a point of clarification that these new standards would be applied to businesses that are already in place throughout the community, correct? So it's not just new development, it's that we would be evaluating, and part of the reason for the community engagement and reaching out to businesses to really discuss what the implications would be for existing businesses as well, correct?
That's correct, Mayor. And obviously we wouldn't be moving existing businesses, right? So we're talking about business expansion and redevelopment, right? So that it would become, some of those businesses might become non-conforming because they would not be meeting those new buffers. So it would apply to any redevelopment that would occur.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. Along that line, I remember in the original report from Beyond Toxics that they had proposed for existing businesses, insurance requirements or some kind of mitigation effort that would help us, right? Because you just mentioned that J.H. Baxter was not conforming to code. So how do we prevent that from happening again if in the future these businesses are not following guidelines and we're going through this again? Is there some sort of way that we can have some insurance requirement or something of that nature, not necessarily that exacting?
Yeah, and I know that Reed has given this some thought, but one of the things that we can look at, obviously there are permits that are required from LRAPA and DEQ and these other agencies. And we could look at building that into our development process and permitting process to make sure that they have those permits in place. I guess another thing that we could be thinking about is, are there additional enforcement tools that the city could use in addition to those that LRAPA and DEQ might have? So part of the outreach and research that we would do is talking with those agencies and seeing again if there are gaps and are places where we could be more effective if there were violations.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to learning more and going through this process.
Okay, Randy, second round.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had my hand up to respond to some questions that were raised that I do know the answers of. Currently, contamination has been found up to Elmira Road, which is Baxter is off of Roosevelt, so that's a full block that it's covered, and it's a large block. But they are still trying to find the outer limits of where the contamination exists. So it could and probably does go further than that. Secondly, regard to Councilor Leach's question about financial responsibility, if you'll all recall that this information on toxic issues really came at us in 3 work sessions based on 3 separate either motions or council polls. The first was tools and strategies for addressing chronic toxic polluters, which was to help us understand what we as a council and we as a city can do to help address chronic toxic polluters. The second one was risk bonds. And the risk bonds, Councilor Leach, that was intended to provide financial responsibility and make sure that funds are in place in case we have a situation where a company declares inability to pay and files bankruptcy, that we still have money to correct any problems that have developed. And then the third one was the public health overlay zone. And this work session is obviously a response to that. We learned in a previous work session that if we actually implemented a public health overlay zone, which is a geographic area, planning staff would have to go into every single file per address and change the zoning in that, which at the time sounded prohibitive, especially considering how strapped our planning staff is. And this, we're coming at this in a new way to try to find maybe a better approach that covers the entire city, in making sure that we do have buffers as businesses expand or new businesses pop up. And this isn't intended to be business unfriendly, if you will. In fact, some of the businesses I've talked with, were initially concerned when we started talking about the issues. They don't want to be on top of housing either because it creates problems for them as well. So this is just being good stewards of our community and making sure that we are allowing commerce to occur responsibly, but also protecting our community members, especially in sensitive areas like residential, schools, and parks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Oh, let Matt have his first round.
Thanks, Mayor. It's just in response to one of the inquiries about spacing or distance. I'm referencing an ORAPA, my ORAPA notes from 2021. There is an air monitor, or in 2021, my notes indicate that the ORAPA air monitoring station in West Eugene is within a mile. It's about a mile from J.H. Baxter. Recorded an exceedingly high spike in naphthalene in 2019 that coincided with the alleged air quality violations. LRAPA issued a notice of violation and a notice of civil penalty assessment of $8,000 and was subsequently reduced to $4,000. And in addition, DEQ did identify J.H. Baxter as the most likely source of dioxin soil in local groundwater, of dioxin soil residues and PCPs in local groundwater. Be really clear there. I don't have an answer based on my notes as to how far that was from J.H. Baxter, but to address Councilor Clark's issue or inquiry, it's my understanding that the air monitoring station was within a mile of J.H. Baxter.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. And that leaves with a great segue. Thank you, Councilor. I appreciate it. So a lot of the conversation here has been framed in where industrial businesses are sited in the future. But it's a two-way street from my mind. And so I would wonder, Lydia, maybe, can you talk about the land use code process, the mechanics on the ground for how we would create a buffer zone. In other words, we've got X amount of buildable lands that are in the buildable land supply. Obviously, we couldn't allow housing to be built inside of a buffer zone to an industrial area. So is that covered perhaps under, findings of some nature that you'd have to have in discussing the siting of a potential residential land? I mean, is it something that you'd have to prove a certain distance away? I mean, is that regular in the process for a potential hazard?
I mean, in terms of what we're thinking, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, and I know Reed and I saw Lauren popped in, may have some other comments, but the buffer zones would be on the industrial lands, right? We're not necessarily saying that we can't create housing in this buffer area. It's more that
even with existing potentially hazardous industry.
Oh, I see. Well, you mean prohibiting housing adjacent to existing industry?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something that we would look at. I'm going to look to Reed and Lauren to see if they have any further thoughts or info on that.
And my question is really, is there a mechanism in the process that captures that? Potentially hazardous siting areas.
Oh, you mean looking at, I mean, there are, we do work with, for instance, when we issue permits, DEQ. And so we are aware if there are hazardous soils, for instance, that need to be mitigated or, corrected before some kind of construction occurs. Is that what you're?
What I mean is, if the groundwater and the residue from a bad actor has the potential to affect where we're intending to site housing, is there a mechanism in the land use code that prevents us from potentially putting people in harm's way doing that? Where we could say, gosh, we'd love to be able to build more housing over here, but we can't because it's too close to a potentially hazardous situation.
Well, and again, if there are known hazards, and the same is true for, slides, a lot of these things can be mitigated. So there can be corrective action. The engineers tell me almost anything can be engineered. If there are known contaminants or known areas that are not currently developed with residential, I think we do have mechanisms. So we wouldn't be permitting new homes there. And I can think of like the Pioneer Business Park, which there are places that have been identified where actually even commercial buildings could not be built. So again, I think that's something that we would be looking into in more detail. Lauren, do you have something else?
I apologize. I also want them to address the event of a bad actor. So in other words, part of the significance of the damage of J.H. Baxter was because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And so in order to avoid that outcome at all costs, is there anything in land use code that prevents us from putting people in that harm's way, potentially, with how we site housing?
Councilor Clark, I think we're hearing your questions, and I think that will be part of the analysis that staff does in putting together a proposal for these industrial development standards. I'm not aware of any particular land use regulations that speak to the, potential for pollution by a particular kind of use and its adjacency to another kind of use. That's not typically how the land use code works. Typically, we would rely on code enforcement and other kinds of mechanisms for dealing with bad actors. But your questions are well taken, and thinking about how these development standards could impact industrially zoned and designated properties, residentially zoned and designated properties, and as council knows, we'll be doing a lot of looking at those inventories in the near future. So I think it's a good time to kind of be thinking about all of those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, because if the businesses are already there or the zoning is already there with a business that could be sold to someone else, we want to be careful of that, right? I mean, and if land use code doesn't prevent, then we'll want to take a look at that the same way we'd look at a safety zone of some nature, right?
Okay, are
That
you?
was kind of an open question, but I
Yeah,
didn't see any
Yeah,
head.
you were sort of nodding. So I think the question has been heard, and the responses that will be factored into the analysis to come if council moves forward. Okay, I have Matt for a second round and Randy for a third.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief. I just didn't want my comments to be misinterpreted when I pointed out the location of an air monitoring station. That does not mean that pollutants can't affect residents within multiple miles of the site of a polluter's site. The Oregon Health Authority did a study between 2010 and 2018 looking at cancer. It was like a West Eugene cancer analysis. And the question was posed: are cancer rates higher in West Eugene within several miles of the J.H. Baxter site? Yes. Out of 22 cancer types analyzed, rates of lung cancer and Hodgkin's lymphoma were slightly higher, and that data is supported by the Pacific Northwest Center for Translational Environmental Health Research, and it comes from the Oregon Health Authority. So just because there was an air monitoring station a mile from J.H. Baxter certainly does not mean that residents within multiple miles were not exposed. Just want to be very clear, Mayor.
Okay, thank you for that. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief. 2 points. One is when Councilor Syret and I either made motions or did work session polls on the 3 areas I mentioned previously. The intent was those were kind of a bundle that we're going to, work together. And I recognize that hasn't been possible to really look at them that way because this process has been pretty drawn out and protracted. And I understand why people are busy. But one of the things that we were looking for is a wrap up at the end when we get to some point where we have kind of resolution on these issues, getting back together and kind of staff helping us tie these together so we understand how they work. And then the other point I wanted to make, I know for a fact when we made the motion on the public health overlay zone, the intent was it would apply not just to siting new industry, but also siting housing tracts that would be on top of existing industry. The fact is, we believe a buffer needs to be there at some responsible, scientifically determined level, regardless of who the moving party is, to put sensitive uses in close proximity to industry. Thank you.
Okay, I think if there are no other council comments, it is back to you, Randy, to put a motion on the table.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to direct the city manager to initiate a land use code amendment to implement public health industrial development standards.
Second.
All right, all in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Thank you. That passes unanimously. That is terrific. Thank you so much for that work, and we look forward to hearing the next step. And with that, I guess I will turn it back to the manager to introduce our second item.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next item is one of the items that's been hanging out there for a while too, a discussion about gas stations. And I believe that Jeff Gepper is leading this conversation. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, City Manager, and good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. I'm going to share my presentation briefly. Give me 1 second to do that. All right, so I'm here, Jeff Gepper, Senior Planner from the Planning Division, and I'm here this afternoon to talk about gas stations. This is in response to Councilor Keating's City Council poll, which was really looking at gas stations within the city of Eugene, the regulations surrounding them, and numerous other questions that I'm going to do my best to answer today. As many of those questions as possible, and within my realm, which is the land use code. So just to kick it off, gas stations, kind of looking at the numbers, we have 42 gas stations within the city of Eugene currently. 6 of those were established within the last since 2018, and 2 of those are on the intersection of Highway 9 and Roosevelt. We had a couple near the downtown area on 6th and 7th Avenue. We had one out on West 11th and another one way out on Western One Way and Barger on a small piece of commercial property. And so what you generally do see from this, just a visualization, is a trend to see gas stations located on arterials and some of our higher traffic streets and clustered around those major intersections. And so thinking about this from the context of gas stations and our world, which is the land use code and zoning, is really to look at where are gas stations allowed, generally speaking, first and foremost. So gas stations are permitted on most of our commercial zones, most of our industrial zones, as well as a handful of special area zones that kind of implement either a commercial or industrial designation. So looking at the map, you can see that those commercial areas do tend to be focused around kind of exactly where you see gas stations being located, which is our major corridors around town, that being the West 11th and headed on that side of town, as well as the 99 corridor, Coburg Road, Willamette, the downtown, and Delta Highway, as well as the Beltline. So with that, we do have many zones actually that don't permit gas stations. So they either outright prohibit them, or by excluding them, they don't allow them. So those would be things like our residential zones, our parks and natural space zones, or natural resource zones, as well as a handful of overlay zones and special area zones that just outright say you can't have a gas station in this location. Now, gas stations within the actual context of the text of the land use code is actually kind of interesting, because we don't have a definition for the term gas station. We don't have definition for electrical vehicle charging station. What we have is a definition called service station. Now, service station just deals with the dispensing of fuels for motor vehicles, as well as a bunch of other accessory uses that can be done in concert with said fuel dispensing station. And a lot of the reason for that definition being so broad is that, as most of you probably experience with gas stations around town, it's in conjunction with a convenience store, or many of them used to be in conjunction with a small garage or shop, which is why we have this very broad definition. So one of the things I'll talk about later is just if we head down the road of a land use code amendment, one of the things that we would really be looking at would be defining more explicitly what a gas station is in the context of more modern situation. And then all the gas stations fall under the motor vehicle related use categories when it comes to those use tables that we use to either allow or prohibit or condition a use in a zone. So the development standards and permitting for gas stations, there are no special development standards. That doesn't mean there aren't development standards, but as many of you remember, we had a very robust set of special development standards that applied to things like middle housing and the Willamette Greenway and some of the other code amendments like that. We don't have those for gas stations as a specific use. So what we do have is they're subject to the general standards for the applicable zone. So things like setbacks, heights, landscaping, those types of general standards still have to be met. Additionally, there are more important ones for gas stations like stormwater standards that have explicit rules around, making sure that there's no leaching of any fuels offsite. So in addition to those development standards that happen at the time of a building permit, you also have land use applications. The first one being a traffic impact analysis. Traffic impact analysis is a planning director level decision that really looks at the potential impact of high traffic generators, which gas stations typically are. So they usually do go through this process, which includes noticing to the people around it. And there are other land use applications that do sometimes get triggered by zones or overlay zones, but most most typically we see the traffic impact analysis coming in for those. But that said, Eugene's land use code regulations aren't the only ones that are actually controlling gas stations. We have many other agencies with a various, set of rules that are applying to different kind of focus points on gas stations, whether that's the emitting of fumes at, of the gas, or the leaching of fuel into offsite, whether that's into the earth, water system, or otherwise. So the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level, we've got the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, state of Oregon. And then locally, we've got the Lane Regional Air Protection Agency, or LRAPA. They all have a various set of standards that apply to gas stations that they have to comply with. Additionally, the Eugene Fire Marshal's Office has regulations associated with underground storage tanks and safety from fire issues on gas stations. And then the Building Permit Services team has a number of additional standards, from erosion control to on-site water management, discharge, things of that nature, that they also take care of, that kind of through the building code are happening in conjunction with our land use code. So one of the big questions with this poll was looking at potential regulatory options for gas stations in Eugene. And we kind of broke this up into 3 tiers. And before I dive into each one of these tiers, I'll say that each one of these options would be part and parcel with a land use code amendment process. And that includes, not only demonstrating compliance with the approval criteria, but it also means a set of public engagement, making sure that we talk to, not only the community, but also the business community, people who are using these services, or these services might be integral to their business need. Obviously, that's changing over time, but that public engagement is going to be really important when looking at this, whatever potential option we may go down the road of. So the first tier is really just the most straightforward. It's just to ban new gas stations. Tier 2 would be regulating the siting of new gas stations. I'll get into that one in more detail. And then the third would be implementing some actual special development standards for gas stations. So Tier 1, like I said, it's the most simple, and it's really looking at defining gas stations outright and then just not allowing them. It would be using the land code to essentially prohibit new gas stations from being located in Eugene. While it's a simple textual change within the code, it's subject to a very high degree of risk from challenges and appeals, and us getting that right. So it might be easy to make the changes, but the background work is going to be more robust. 2, the siting of new gas stations. We could look at using buffers from existing uses to essentially limit where gas stations can be found. That could be other existing gas stations. We've seen other jurisdictions do it from schools and then also residential zones. And so we actually created a web map, which was linked in the AIS. And you can toggle on and off kind of all these different options to look at kind of what the impact is. But what you'll find is that overall, if we look at gas station buffers, it does, if you go a half mile out, it is looking at a pretty significant, limitation on where gas stations can be located when you combine that with the allowed zones. Even more so if you buffer things from our residential zones, which is what this map is showing here. And so, with that, we can really control where new gas stations would be sited. Finally, Tier 3, this would be really looking at creating special development standards that are intended to, mitigate any potential negative externalities through, enhanced setbacks, more landscaping, size, scale limitations, or even, looking towards the future and requiring electric vehicle facilities in concert with any new gas station. Speaking of electric vehicle charging stations, like I said, this is not something that is outright talked about in our code right now. So they just had to comply with our general standards. So there's no specific standards or definition for electric vehicle charging stations. That said, the climate friendly and equitable communities work that's coming out of the state and being implemented here locally through the Eugene parking reform right now mostly, and then also through the building code. We do have, some new requirements for, whether it's electric vehicle charging facilities within a parking lot, or within the parking reform, regulating the actual size and scale of those electric facilities within parking lots as well. So with that, I'll just say that we're interested in hearing what some input from the city council today. We would likely need to do a significant amount of further research, looking at refining those concepts, and then also engaging with the public to find out kind of where we are at with this process and what potential impacts it may have to the community. So with that, I will turn that back over, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really a great presentation. I really want to appreciate the packet here and the laying out of the 3 tiers, which I think has really certainly helped me, and I think other counselors sort of frame this out at the different levels and ways we could approach that. So the floor is open. Are there counselors who wish to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, there we go. I have Jennifer, then Randy, then Matt. Oh, Jennifer, then Randy. Matt, did you take your hand down? Okay, Jennifer, Randy, Matt, then Mike. Okay, got it.
Thank you. So thanks so much for that presentation. First off, you mentioned that on the first tier, that while a ban is the easiest to do, that it would take the most work behind the scenes to make sure we get it right. And I'm wondering if that is still the case with a pause. If we just said, for this amount of time, we're going to stop building them while we do additional work to figure out what we want to do into the future. Is that kind of the same situation, or would that be easier to do than a flat ban?
So that kind of what I believe you're talking about would be kind of more of a moratorium as opposed to a land use code amendment. Moratoria are, I don't have much experience with them, so I can't speak to them directly. The things that I know about them is that typically their time frame doesn't last as long as, say, a land use code amendment would require. So you might put in a moratorium, but it wouldn't get us to the end of the land use code amendment. So that might be difficult to line up there. And then I'm also not sure what the criteria for establishing a moratorium is. So I believe you have to have a significant amount of rationale and reason for that to stand. But I would offer up anybody who has more experience with that to talk more about it. But we can definitely look into it. That's very much a possibility.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. That's all the questions I have at this time.
Lauren, I saw you put your camera on, so I'm just wondering if you wanted to speak to that.
Thank you, Mayor. Everything that Jeff said, I want to echo. I'm happy to provide more detail if counselors want about the specific statutes that control city's ability to place moratoria on development, but the general high points that Jeff hit are correct.
Okay, thank you. Randy, then Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. I was kind of coming from this from the same position Councilor Ye said, of thinking more of a time certain temporary halt while we get more information on the subject. But I do understand the reason for wanting this. I guess one of my questions is, would a ban apply to, let's say, a trucking firm, private trucking firm that's located here in town that wants to install a private fueling station for just their use?
It could, I'll say it can be. We would need to just make sure that during a land use code amendment process that we would incorporate that change if that's something that the council is specifically interested in.
I just see that as one area that I'm sure we might see some pushback on. And, as we go forward, it would be nice to try and make something as smooth as possible that we do. I guess that's the main question I had. Oh, I know there's another question I had. I know we're focusing some on electrification at these sites, which I agree with. Is there any thought around hydrogen fuel cells for transportation, and would there be room in the code for adding a piece about this in the future? Because that is one of the things I see in the future for transportation that actually makes sense sense with more range than what fuel gives. And, you know, the output is water vapor.
Thank you, Counselor. That's a great question, and actually not something that's, you know, we were focused on electric vehicle charging and traditional fossil fuels. However, you know, we could during this process look into, when we look at the definition of, you know, fuel service centers or however we end up defining it, look at, you know, try to be forward thinking and seeing where those potential alternative fuel sources would come into play.
Thank you. That's what I'm looking for. And I mean, there may be alternative fuels that are not even on our radar at this point, but just, you know, having some flexibility around alternative fuel sources and types, I think would be beneficial to the process. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Matt, and then Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm prepared to make a motion, but I wanted to just before I do, thank staff for this presentation. It's been a long time in the making. I think you've made it. You've presented very clearly where we're at, and I really appreciate your attention to detail. I see in parts of even South Eugene, there are areas where where the zoning would allow for a service station or a gas station to be built. That gives me pause, considering we have 42 and rising. And in some parts of the community, gas stations where they are on multiple corners, in some parts of our community where residents are within a 5-minute drive of multiple gas stations. So both from a public health safety position and from a position of leaning into our climate goals and ensuring that EV charging stations are more ubiquitous, my motion is, Mayor and Council, a move to initiate a land use code amendment that prohibits new gas stations within 500 feet of any dwelling or educational facility. 2, requires any new gas station to provide a minimum of 1 electric vehicle charging station for every 4 fuel pumps. 3, requires any expansion of an existing gas station, fuel distribution facility, or fuel storage facility to provide a minimum of 2 electric vehicle charging stations. And 4, defines necessary terms such as gas station, EV charging station, and educational facility.
You have a second?
I'll second it,
Mayor.
so we can have a discussion.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was gonna second, do the same thing, but
Okay.
Counselor Randy beat me to it.
Okay. All right.
And Mayor, I made one slight edit to this motion was sent out by legal counsel last night. So thank you, Catherine, for sharing that with colleagues. The one slight edit I just want to be very clear is in the definition, because Jeff indicated that there are no standards or definitions for EV charging stations. I wove EV charging stations into that 4th piece of the motion, which defines necessary terms such as gas station, EV charging station, and educational facility, just to be really clear and transparent.
Okay, thank you. So, Mike, I know your hand was raised before that motion came up, but you're in the queue next, and then it looks like Emily.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. This is an interesting discussion. I think the motions are premature for me because of what we know and what we don't know so far, especially with regard to potential dangers of charging stations. We don't know the answer to that. I mean, I know it takes 60,000 gallons to put out a battery fire, for example. You know, I mean, and there are things we don't know yet. But I did want to ask Jeff. I didn't see anything in the materials. Did you do any sort of marketing research to find out how the prevalence or the scarcity of gas stations affects the price of gas in our community?
No, I did not look into that specific question.
So we don't know, for example, if, new gas stations are needed in order to keep prices from spiking, or, you know, we don't know the effect of putting a pause or a moratorium on, or not permitting gas stations on the price of gas that all of us pay. Is that correct?
Yeah, at this time, yeah, so one of the questions that Councilor Keating posed in the poll was to identify, you know, how many gas stations does Eugene need based on its population? In our preliminary research of that, the methodology that different agencies had conducted to identify that varied widely. And so without a significant amount more research, you know, we really don't have that answer before us at this time. And
Right.
really it's just assuming that the market is currently driving that at this time.
Well, if we step in and say the market doesn't get to expand any more than we are, though, right? You know, so I would like to learn quite a bit more about this, but I think it's premature for voting in favor of acting at this point. I'm concerned about the effect on the market. I don't know that it would be significant. I don't know that it wouldn't, but I think it's important to know that before we take this sort of regulatory effect, because oftentimes it's the situations where, you know, the prices go up on people who can least afford to pay them that we ought to be concerned with. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Emily and then Greg.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It's complicated. I think it's really important. Basically, gas stations are poisonous. Obviously, we need them now. We have enough. Everybody's filling up their cars. And we're saying we're going to have less cars that need gas. So I'd prefer an outright ban, but I also recognize that that's very, very challenging to do. So if we want to do something, we're somewhat limited. I would like to make a friendly to change it to 1,000 feet within 500 feet of my house. Feels really close, and I already have one 2 blocks away. We have 1,000 feet for hot shops. We have 1,000 feet for camping from water and educational facilities. And I think gas stations are more dangerous than pot shops and campers. So would you accept that friendly?
Absolutely, Councilor Semple.
Thank you.
The second.
I'm not sure I'm ready to accept that. I want to ask a couple questions before we go there.
So I'm not sure that we've got a second on that, but it's out there.
So so right now it's not amended, the maker and the second need to accept it. So after there's additional discussion, we can kind of loop back to it. And then Councilor Semple, you can also just make it as a motion to amend at this time as well. Those are kind of your two options.
So I could make it now, or I could wait for more discussion.
Yep.
All right, I will wait, but I will bring it back. Thank you.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, Greg and then Alan.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. One is, what is the legality of a moratorium in the first place, whether it's a time limited moratorium or it's one that is a permanent moratorium on the building of gas stations? Do we know, City Attorney?
I can let Lauren speak to some of the specifics around the statutory provisions about moratoriums. There's kind of two ways that I saw that I'm hearing the word moratorium be used. The phrase moratorium or term moratorium in the land use world is a vernacular that's associated with a very specific process and time limit and all of those things, and certain findings have to be made they last for I believe a maximum of 120 days, versus banning through our development code, through our chapter 9, just saying there is no zone in which they're allowed is not a moratorium. It's just they're not allowed in any of our zones. versus not changing our land use code and going through the state statutory process of basically putting on hold what is currently allowed.
So let me get a little finer in detail on this question. And I know this is more wordsmithing. Would the word suspension be more appropriate for a time limited type of way of saying, we're not going to move forward with new gas stations at this time. We're suspending, permitting those types of facilities for, a year or 2 years?
It would still be, whether we use the term suspend or moratorium, it would still be meeting the definition of what a moratorium is, which is we're not changing the underlying. So it's kind of, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. And Lauren, I see you're unmuted. If I'm messing this up, please jump in. You know more about this than I do.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the question is whether council is looking to take action without amending the land use code or by amending the land use code. If you're taking action to disallow gas stations without amending the land use code, that falls within the statutory definition of the moratorium, and there are a bunch of rules that apply. You could amend the land use code to remove gas stations as a permitted use in some or all areas of the city for ever or for some period of time. That would not be a moratorium, but that won't take effect until the land use code is amended. So you have to go through the amendment process, adopt the ordinance, and then that would take effect.
Yes. And I would just add, like, that would be like your kind of what you're used to of having an ordinance sunset. So that's kind of that third option in the middle, that it's not a permanent amendment and it's not a moratorium. You could adopt an ordinance. Again, you'd have to go through an ordinance adoption process, but you could have that ordinance then sunset after a certain amount of time to kind of hit that.
So my next question is for Jeff. Jeff, one of the things that in my own, my own research around this is the production of lithium batteries as certain environmental byproducts or pollution kinds of effects in that process. What do we know what those effects are? And can we be open to other energy sources like hydrogen or other sources of that nature that could be applied in powering EVs?
Thank you, Councilor Evans. That's a great question. I think similar to Councilor Groves's kind of indication of this same interest, we can definitely look into what that looks like to include and make sure that a land use code amendment would incorporate, other alternative fuel sources to make sure that we have that availability moving forward. What that looks like at this time, I do not know, because we just haven't gone down that road yet. No pun intended.
But do we know the negative consequences or outcomes of production with regard to lithium batteries?
Not
I know that they tell you to take out any lithium batteries on the plane because, planes are now using lithium batteries and they could explode or blow up.
Absolutely. My familiarity with that is probably similar to yours. It was not something that we researched as part of this project to date.
Okay, well, I hope at some point we can get staff's feedback and research on that, because I think that's an important factor for us to look at as we move forward in these conversations.
Absolutely, that's definitely heard and in my notes.
Okay, thank you. Alan and then Lindsay.
Yeah, I appreciate the sentiment of the motion, and clearly, and I've been a strong supporter of reducing greenhouse gases emissions and getting off fossil fuels and reduce fossil fuel use. But I don't agree with this tactic. This is effectively a ban on gas stations because of the unattainable requirements. So it's a ban without using the word ban. The 500-foot, even 1,000-foot, probably put almost all 90% land off limits. Looks like most of the gas stations that exist wouldn't be able to be where they are, and effectively EV charging won't take place at gas stations, and gas stations won't put them in, so they probably won't choose to do it because of the cost and the space required. There's a reason there's no EV charging at gas stations right now. It takes too long, and so if you'll have EV owners having to sit in a gas station exposed to the same fuels that you're trying to deal with at a gas station for 15 to 60 minutes while they recharge. That's not okay for residential areas and other areas, but it is okay for EV owners to sit in a gas station and do that for a very long time and be heavily exposed. It's an unpleasant place to sit and do that. And so who's going to sit there and do that at a gas station? So effectively, and then we'll compete with other spaces and locations like offices and stores and malls and grocery stores where people can go in, charge their car, and come back out. So now we have 2% EVs in Oregon, probably around 4 or 6 in Eugene. It's higher, and so we still have 90+% of our vehicles are combustion engines, and EVs will increase over time with the Advanced Clean Cars rule, and probably about 2028, 2030. They'll become a majority, but we still have tens of thousands of cars in Eugene, millions in Oregon that are going to be gasoline powered. So, and all of this transition will happen regardless of any actions by the city council. And the market will handle what happens to them. If we push in a ban, what we'll do is we'll push people out to Springfield and outside the city, so they'll travel further, creating more greenhouse gases, which is counterproductive to what we're trying to actually accomplish. Finally, I'm not sure why we actually haven't learned a lesson from the gas ban, taking on another not $1 billion but $1 trillion business that will probably get delayed and divide the community needlessly, and actually have almost very, very insignificant greenhouse gas emission reductions. So I'll need a second round, Mayor.
Okay, Lindsay.
I'm actually going to wait on my comments until I hear from Councilor Zelenka again, if that's okay.
All right, that's fine. So for second rounds, I have Jennifer, Randy, Mike, and then Alan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also looking forward to what everyone has to say, and honestly haven't 100% made up my decision, but I have to say that I think there's 2 issues here that we're talking about at the same time that aren't necessarily should be solved in the same way. The safety of living next to a gas station, breathing in toxic fumes, or having it exposed to the groundwater and our soil of our community is one issue, which is very important. I mean, we just finished talking about toxic polluters. Like, I'm not okay with that. I don't think we need more of that in our community, especially considering that we all live very close to one. I had to fuel my car yesterday. It was very easy. I did not have to go very far. And I live in North Eugene, where there aren't quite as many. And then EV charging is a totally separate issue that doesn't necessarily need to be solved through gas stations. I actually agree with Alan that as an EV owner, I would prefer not to sit at a gas station where there's one charging or 2 chargers and fuel my vehicle. I'm going to go to a place where there's multiples, and I'm more likely to find a slot that's open, or I won't have to wait as long than trying to drive around town looking for that one spot that's open. So that may not be, I could be wrong though. I don't think making those decisions today about how we should convert our system to EVs is a good choice. I think we need more information to be making good long-term decisions about how future car drivers are going to charge their vehicles, because I think the writing is kind of on the wall. We're switching. We're making a fuel conversion in this country, and it's happening. And we should get ahead of it, I think, but making rash decisions about how we're going to do that, I don't think is a good decision. So I personally, I don't know, a moratorium or something with a sunset date makes more sense to me, because we can take a temporary pause, not build more toxic polluting businesses in our community, and figure out what we need, where we need it, where we don't need it, how we're going to move forward, without having to make assumptions about things we may not have all the information for. So that's kind of where I am, but I'm really curious to see what other people are thinking as well.
Okay, thank you. Randy, then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. And Councilors Zelinka and Ye just basically summed up a lot of what I'm feeling and thinking about. I do have mixed emotions about this. You know, on one hand, I do want to get more toxicity out of our environment, but on the other hand, I just don't feel like we have all of our questions answered at this point. You know, I'm still wanting to have a way of protecting business and industry that rely on transportation to be able to have their own fueling sites without a ban on that. That's one piece I feel strongly about. The second piece is, can staff perform more research on market impacts? Getting back to what Councilor Clark said, I would like to hear those answers as well. And also, I would be interested in how we stack up in the state and maybe even nationally. Is there some place we can go to perform research on the number of fueling stations per capita? What is the norm, so that we have an understanding of what it is? My sense is we're all feeling a certain something, but I don't want to make decisions based on feelings. I want to make decisions based on science and fact, and so that we're making responsible decisions for our community. And again, I don't want to drag my feet on this, but at the same time, I want to make sure I know what we're deciding and what the projected impacts are. And I just don't think we're ready to understand that today. You know, even in the AIS, there's not a place for emotion, although I do appreciate Councilor Keating trying to get out in front of this thing, or some people would say we're slow to react. But at the same time, I want more information before we make hard decisions that are going to have an impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And then I have Alan for another round.
Yeah, Randy summed up my reason for saying it was premature better than I did. There's a lot of things we don't know, and I'd like to. And first and foremost, I want to say that whenever I can say I agree with every word that Alan Zelinka said, I want to take it, so I do. There's an awful lot of talk, and you know, gasoline isn't a healthy thing, right, for people, right? Everybody knows that, but everything has a risk, and the question is relative risk. And so, Jeff, I guess I'm asking, with all of the federal, state, and other agencies that regulate gas stations, I don't even know how to ask the question, but I want to understand how much risk is there relative to another kind of business in our environment. I mean, you would think with that much regulatory, that many regulatory agencies at play, that there could be all kinds of information on that, and I'd like to know more. In the same way, Randy's question was, let's talk about actual facts that we know the answer to instead of how we feel. I don't want to make decisions based on feelings. I want to make them based on data and logic and reason. And there's quite a bit we don't know here. And I would welcome the opportunity to learn more. So especially it was some of the other questions that have been brought up so far. I'd be very interested to know the answers. Thank you. Oops.
Okay, thank you. So I have Alan, and then Lindsay may be coming back, but Sarah, I'm wondering, did you want to jump?
I'll wait until people have spoken. I was going to just address a couple of what I think I've heard.
And Emily, I do have you on the list. So I have Alan and then Lindsay for a first round, and then Emily, and then Matt, and then Greg. Okay. So Alan, take it away.
We are clearly switching, as Jennifer said, but EVs are not going to be installed at gas stations. People won't choose to go there. It's not pleasant. There'll be fumes that we'd be exposing people to. And this is just going to be yet another divisive measure that will take a lot of time and effort against a well-funded entity and not really reduce any greenhouse gases or have a significant impact on health, I don't believe. As a pragmatic person who wants to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and win that battle, we should be spending our limited amount of time and effort and resources on actions that actually reduce significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions and that a majority of people can support. I'm not sure why we didn't learn lessons from the gas ban and why we're willing to stub our toe again. Wouldn't be surprised at all if this doesn't end up similar to the gas ban. It feels like deja vu all over again. I'll point out that there are other ways to handle the fumes, including an upcoming DEQ regulation that's going on right now that's going to come out in 2024 to significantly reduce fumes emissions from nozzles at gas stations. And finally, new gas stations with the latest technology for fumes and leaks wouldn't be able to be replaced the existing ones because we'd have a ban. Wouldn't we want to have the new gas stations instead of having the old ones stay in place for even longer? That doesn't make any sense to me either. And then finally, Randy's point, or second to finally, hydrogen is likely to be at gas stations. You can have a tank there. So what they do in California, and it'll be trucked there, but and it takes less time to actually fuel a hydrogen car than a gasoline car. So and I'll just point out, I sent earlier that Oregon, the Pacific Northwest just got $1 billion for a hydrogen hub in the Pacific Northwest to promote hydrogen and potentially for transportation use. So I think that's going to be a significant game changer. $1 billion is a lot of money. And then finally, I would support, Greg was talking earlier about an EV charging plan, developing an EV charging plan and working with EWEB and others to actually figure out how this actually should be done. Gas stations is not where you do it. It's just effectively creating a ban because it won't happen on gas stations by not saying a ban. So I'm not in favor of this action at this point. There's just too many problems with it and too many unknowns.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to pause my comments. I certainly am in favor of more gas stations being built for a variety of reasons. Many of that is public health reasons, our leaking storage tanks, and our climate environment. However, I do hear and understand the concerns from other counselors. I do want more information, and I am not opposed to separating this conversation around the electric vehicle charging, looking at the staff plans, the planning for electric vehicles as a whole citywide systems plan, along with more the hydrogen fueling. This is a brand new topic that I don't really know anything about, the hydrogen and what that would look like, in terms of like Councillor Clark's points about the market. We need more market data. I know the trend lines and projections for how many electric vehicles we will have in our city in the next 10 to 15 years. We will need additional charging for those vehicles, and I want us to be prepared for a future for that can respond to that need for EV charging. But what does that look like? I know, like other counselors have said, I wouldn't be sitting in a gas station unless it was absolutely necessary. That's why you see the larger electric vehicle charging along the highways with other amenities, so that people that need that rapid fueling or charging can get that most of those people are not going to be coming, all the way deep into Eugene to access that. So I would like to see a bigger systems plan around that, and put some investment into that. And, but also I'm supportive of a pause or looking at other ways to stop and take a look further into how can we meet that market demand, but meet our public health, our climate action goals. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Emily, and then Matt, and then Greg.
Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation, bringing up a lot of good things. Sorry, neighborhood members, I'm not going to get to you today. Essentially, all these restrictions, which if we're going to do, I still like the 1,000 feet, are just ways to get a ban. And we all know that. And I prefer to just be honest and say, we need to ban gas stations. And I don't think we're ready for that. I certainly do not want the gas stations filling up the gas providers filling up our public forums. So that's what I'd like to do, but I don't think the time is right. I'm a big fan of moving to divide, and this motion screams for it. I agree with my colleagues that it's two separate issues, and we could probably move forward more quickly on getting more EV charging stations than in banning gas stations. My concern isn't so much about the greenhouse gases, although that's certainly near the top of my concerns. It's the poison. It's the poison from the gas stations that's going into the groundwater that I'm breathing. I hate going to the gas stations. I would pay somebody, not very much, I'm poor, to take my car to the gas station. But I only fill it every 2 or 3 months because I walk everywhere. So these things aren't going to affect me that much, except there is a gas station 2 blocks from my house. I'm wondering if we change, what our restrictions are, if we could just make it not near other gas stations, because I live right near 6th and 7th, where we have a new gas station right by 2 other gas stations. So is the competition going to make the price go down? I'm not sure. Gas prices seem to be totally out of our control. So I don't know if this is to substitute or make another motion later, but I think we're in a position where we need to have another work session. And this is not without precedent. Often when we realize we don't have enough information, we pause and wait to make the motions later. So that's what I'd like to see us do, and I don't know whether I move to substitute or what. Thanks.
Counselor Semple, you certainly can. If you want to, there's a couple options. I mean, you could move to postpone this motion until a date certain. You could move to substitute this motion with a motion to direct the city manager to schedule a follow-up work session to further discuss the issues raised today. I mean, there's depending on what you want to see happen with the motion on the table, or this motion could be voted on and it could be voted up or down. And if it's voted down, then you can make your motion. There's a variety of options that you have.
Okay, I'd like to move to substitute to direct the city manager to come back with a follow-up work session. Necessarily date certain, but soon. And we can come back to this motion at that time. And if we do, I will suggest 1,000 feet and to divide it. Can we get a second?
Do we have a second?
Second. Yes, I'll second that.
Okay. Okay. So I have a bunch of hands raised, and if you want to speak to the motion that's now on the table, or I'll just take you in the order in which you raised your hands. So I have Matt and then Greg for second rounds, and then Alan.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I might need to change my approach a bit because I'm speaking to this motion. I recognize the intent, but I want to underscore the urgency. It was brought up that if we were to advance any semblance of a suspension or moratorium or ban on new gas stations, that they would just move to Springfield or Coburg or Junction City. We're the Eugene City Council. We're not the Springfield, Junction City, or Coburg City Council. And as a Springfield City Councilor, I can find no justification to continue to allow more gas stations in our neighborhoods. Gas stations become more polluted by releasing toxic emissions and more vehicular traffic. And this attempt makes it easy for the fossil fuel industry to convert. Now let the market or business and industry decide or convert on their own. Well, they won't regulate themselves unless local government steps in. Oh, the price is going to be too high. Well, the price should be going down because there are fewer employees at gas stations. Fewer employees, why are we still paying more at the pump? Well, it's because business and industry, because the market won't regulate itself. 42 gas stations and growing, a 6% spike in the last 5 years is enough to say, pause. If you're going to build another gas station, you're going to include EV charging stations as well. And you're not going to be able to build a gas station within X amount of feet, whether it's 500 or 1,000. And I support Councilor Semple's wise amendment to change that to 1,000 feet. And certainly that prevents 90% of our community from being exposed to toxic, antiquated fossil fuel gas stations, unless they convert appropriately. So this is a matter of public health and safety. This is a matter of leading with our values by trying to get EV charging stations more ubiquitous and throughout our entire community. Talk about data-driven approaches. The current trend of EV sales indicates that 80% of gas stations over the next decade will be unprofitable. So the transportation fuels market needs to fundamentally reinvent. This actually helps them do so. Mayor, I'm saddened to hear we're not taking action today, or it looks like we're not going to take action. I'll support moving this work session to a date certain in the nearest date possible.
Okay, thank you. I have Greg and then Alan.
Yeah. My comments are with regard to the motion that was posed by Councilor Semple, and I seconded. One of the things I want to point out is that we're almost at time. So, Mayor, I think that this conversation needs to be extended for at least 5 or 10 more minutes, if that's good with the rest of council. And then also I want to point out that we were not able to get to our third issue, which is neighborhood planning. And so we're going to probably have to take a reset on that conversation. And I know that there are people that are tuned in to this meeting today that were expecting us to get to the neighborhood planning conversation, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So if I could, see if we can get an extension for 10 minutes on this meeting, and then we could wrap up this discussion. And then my last comment on this is that, I think that we need to have another work session. We do not have enough time to discuss all of the things that have been brought up by myself and other counselors with regard to EV charging and greenhouse gas emissions for existing gas stations and possible new gas stations. So I think that there's some other research that needs to be done. And as I asked, Jeff earlier, if staff can bring back some additional information so that we have the opportunity to look at, what the effects are of other sources of fueling vehicles would be, and what the impacts are environmentally of lithium batteries, as well as we already know what the impacts are of greenhouse gases are concerned. So if we get a bigger picture of what we're looking at, I think that would be helpful in directing council to make policy decisions in this vein, all the way through. So.
Okay, thank you for all of that. So we have a motion to extend. Do we have a second? Okay,
Second.
a motion to extend. Did you say 5 minutes, Greg?
I said 10.
10 minutes, 10 minutes. All in favor, please raise your hands. Okay, that looks like that's unanimous. And I would turn it over to the manager just to respond to the scheduling questions.
Yeah, I was going to say we've been holding Councilor Evans' space on Monday, the 23rd, with the anticipation that you might not get through all of this, and we know that the neighbors have been waiting a really long time. So I'm hoping we can pick up the neighborhood planning on Monday. I think that's Monday. And then this conversation around research in the next work session, I just want to say right now we came with a discussion about land use, because that sort of felt like where we were heading. And I wanted to say that I don't think Jeff Gepper is going to be the right person necessarily to research market and facts and science and data. So we'll need to do a little bit of regrouping amongst us to figure out how to get you the right information, because we're not gas station experts, but we know how to find them. So thank you.
Okay, Alan, one more comment?
Yeah, when we bring this back, can staff do an estimate of what the effect of a 500 or even 1,000 foot buffer would be on available land for gas stations, and if there's any land left, or if it's just basically going to be a ban effectively? So what would be the effect of that? Because I think it's a ban. Second, staff could also bring back information about the proposed DEQ rules on emissions and the rules on leaking gas station or leaking tanks, and what's being done about that from the DEQ's perspective. And then fourth, I think tacking EV stations on the gas stations is effectively promoting a ban. I think it's much smarter to actually figure out where we're going to do the charging. And when we come, I'll work with staff, but when we come back, I'll move to direct the city manager to develop an EV charging plan for the city of Eugene. And then also with the news that we've got $1 billion coming into the Northwest for hydrogen, what the potential is for hydrogen as a transportation fuel, and the potential for what would be the potential and how would you do fueling stations for hydrogen?
I see that Matt Rodriguez has raised his hand, so let me turn that to him.
A quick minute, Mayor. Thank you. Councilor Zelenka, I just wanted to remind council that part of the CAP 2.0, there are 7 distinct actions around EV and EV adoption. One of those is our EV strategy, which already includes doing a plan on public charging. We've actually been working on the scope to go out and get a consultant to do that, and already working in partnership with eWeb to move that out. So that's work that is in process right now.
Yeah, I actually know that, because I actually may have been one of the persons who proposed that. I was wanting it to move up in the queue in terms of priority about what we need to do in terms of this particular issue. So I'll work with staff to make sure that happens in a motion. Thanks.
Okay, so we have Emily's motion on the table. Emily, my sound was burbled, so I would appreciate if you would just restate it for me, because I didn't hear it fully clearly, but then I think we're ready for a vote.
I move to direct the city manager to come back for a second work session to continue this conversation. I don't think it needs to be next week, but we still seem to have a lot to discuss. And I don't know that we need too much more information, as much as I'm giving reasons I'm not supposed to do that. I move that we direct the city manager to come back for a second work session on this topic.
Okay,
Second.
I just have a procedural question because we still have Matt's original motion on the table.
So this is Counselor Semprill's motion to substitute, so
There we
you'll
go.
vote on
That's what I
this.
needed to hear. Okay. Okay, so this is a move to substitute first. So we're voting now on a motion to substitute. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Okay, and now
Who was the one, Mayor?
the one was Mike. And now to
Mayor, no,
all in favor-
I voted in the affirmative, sorry.
Oh, you did. Okay, so that's unanimous then. Terrific. All right, and then now on the motion itself, all in favor, please raise your hands.
So
Okay,
what's on the table right now is the motion as substituted. So it is the motion to direct the scheduling of another work session. That's what's on the table now for vote.
Mayor, it's my understanding that there was there was time sensitive. There was not an exact date, but it was at its earliest possible time. Just want to point that out.
Yes. Okay, all in favor of the motion to come back with another work session, please raise your hand.
Mayor,
Yes.
didn't the city manager say time is certain would be October 27th
The
or no?
23rd is to come back on the neighborhood planning.
On the neighborhood plan? Okay, got you on that.
Okay, one more time. All in favor of this motion to come back for another work session, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Okay. All right. With that, thank you all very much. We will return to this very challenging topic. I appreciate your conversation. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all.